Today we got another round of reveals from the upcoming Empires of the Ascended expansion. This time around, Riot has revealed some supplementary cards is the way I guess I want to call this. I don't want to say filler cards because that just feels disrespectful, but essentially we get a couple of cards from each region, not named Shurima, to kind of flesh things out. Now I say a couple of cards, but actually Noxus got 3 for some reason. All the other regions got 2, and there was no champions today. So we're gonna go through them region by region and talk about the cards that were revealed, starting with Freljord. Freljord has a 2-cost burst spell by the name of Ancestral Boon. This spell reads, grant the top ally in your deck +2/+2. If you are enlightened, instead grant all allies in your deck +2/+2. Now, at first glance, this feels kind of good in the enlightened form because after all, Cosmic Inspiration is oftentimes a really big hit when you're playing the target invoke lists, but there are some noted differences. One, Inspiration hits everything everywhere, so that means your created cards and your cards already established on the board. Meanwhile, Ancestral Boon is only hitting things in your deck, and it's only doing so once you are enlightened, so you're likely pretty far into the game, and at that point you can play your big bombs anyway, so you're kind of planning for the future. I suppose that perhaps you could do some neat stuff with like a War Mother's Call deck, but War Mother's Call again kind of doesn't need any more help once it's popped off, and the only time I even see that as of late anyway is like dedicated Targon's peak lists. So I don't necessarily think Ancestral Boon is going to make a big splash here, just because it feels like one of those cards that is fun, and when you pull it off, it could be a very satisfying way to buff your deck. But even when I compare this to something like the Tusk Raider, for example, it feels a little bit weak to me. Now, just straight up paying 2 to grant the top ally in your deck +2/+2 is maybe worth it when you start playing around with predict shenanigans. One of the things I didn't mention when I talked about the predict mechanic and when that was revealed, I talked about allegiance and how you can use predict to manipulate your allegiance triggers, but Freljord and their buff the top card or top X number of allies in your deck also works pretty well with predict. Now, whether or not that's going to be good enough, I don't know. But if you're already trying to play like a Xenotype Researchers predict list where you are giving units in your deck the +3/+3 and then hunting for them, perhaps adding in the Freljord deck buff package is another way to potentially go about it. I don't know. So if I'm being honest, I think that's where it's going to be the most effective, would actually be in a predict deck. But I'm not super sold on this Freljord card itself. Now, the other Freljord card I'm even less sold on. I'm going to be up front. This is a 3-cost burst spell by the name of Spoils of War. It says grant an ally +1/+2, plunder, grant it +2/+4 instead. Now, for me, when I look at this card, I immediately think of something like Sunblessed Vigor, which is the Targon 2-cost spell. Direct comparisons here basically means you're paying 1 more mana to get a +1/+0 on top of the Sunblessed Vigor. But if I'm being honest, like the appeal of Vigor is just that it buffs health and it's cheap, and so I don't think that the attack buff here is that relevant. Further, if you're playing a plunder deck in Freljord, you're likely playing something overwhelm based, and in that instance I feel like you want a greater emphasis on attack as opposed to health. So Spoils of War in that regard doesn't necessarily feel the greatest either. The +4 health post plunder is kind of nice because it directly lets you counter certain damaging abilities all the way up through Black Spear. So the fact that it can keep a unit alive post plunder is maybe nice, but that's also very situational, right? Like that's post plunder, so that means it's likely only on turns where you have the attack token and after you've attacked. I think that the situational usages that this requires just makes it not a very great card. So I'm not going to talk about it that much longer. Moving on, we're going to talk about the Demacian cards in the top right of this graphic, starting with Dragon CHOW. I love the design of this card, and when I first saw it, I was like this is neat, but it's terrible. And then the more I thought about it, it's not terrible. Like, this is not an S tier card by any means, because dragons and their archetype are not necessarily S tier. But in the dragon archetype, this is actually a pretty good supplementary card. So Dragon CHOW is a 1-cost 0/3, and it reads, when you play a dragon, it strikes me and you draw 1. So at first glance, you're like, okay, well, it's a 1-drop, but it's a 0/3, and then when I play a dragon, it's just gonna eat this, right? Like, yeah, it cycles itself, but why do I care? Well, dragons in this game tend to have fury, so at a minimum, this is likely actually +1/+1, and you draw a card, but you just have to play this before you play the dragon. Now, that's at a minimum, because then you start thinking about stuff like Shyvana, for example. Shyvana, one of the speedy ways that you level her up is obviously through attacking, but then you can use something like single combat or the dragon version of single combat to get your dragons to deal damage, you know, get them to strike things, and then you level her up. So Dragon CHOW is a way where you can make your dragons just strike this. It gives you credit towards leveling your Shyvana. You also draw the card. It's a mini buff to whatever dragon it is. So there's a lot of positives there. If for whatever reason you can somehow give a dragon in your hand lifesteal, or if in this set there are dragons that just inherently have lifesteal, then I think Dragon CHOW ends up being significantly better, because being able to have a Dragon CHOW in play and then gain health just by playing another unit, like you get that burst healing, that would really put it over the top. So I think that right now it's a great card for dragon decks, but dragon decks just aren't that great. So I think that's kind of the holdup here, but it's better than it looks. And I think that its existence could end up being really good in the future if we get more tools to support dragons. So kind of keep an eye out. The other card that was revealed for Demacia is Towering Stonehorn. This is a 6-cost 7/7. It does not have any keywords, but it does say, I don't take damage from enemy spells or skills. And I think that this is okay maybe in expeditions, but outside of that, I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of this card, because just the raw stats I don't think are good enough. This still gets chump blocked by, you know, Dragon CHOWs or whatever. This does not have a keyword itself. It's not a dragon. It's not helping any other archetypes, and it's enemy spells or skills. So it's not like you're using single combat on this, but then it's not taking, you know, damage as a result. I mean, it would still anyway, because that's strike damage, but like, you get my point, right? It's not really doing much. And the fact that it's already a 7/7 means that you, let's be honest, don't care that it was taking damage from spells or skills. Nobody's mystic shotting this thing to death. And if they are, it's likely after you've already got value out of this anyway. You don't get anything additional. The fact that it is as expensive as it is and as big as it is actually hurts its value, in my opinion. I would much rather see this be like a 2-cost 3/2 that suddenly just doesn't die to mystic shot, so you get to throw it into combat kind of guaranteed, or just something more reasonable to make the protection worth it. Because outside of this surviving the Skies Descend, and that's again a really like niche scenario, there's no real reason to run this. So, you know, you might end up with it in an expedition deck, but I just don't see this as being that impactful, unless again, you know, there's some card we haven't seen revealed yet that becomes super meta. Maybe you decide to include this, I don't know, but I just don't see it. All right, we're gonna transition to the Shadow Isles cards in the bottom left of this graphic. We have Sea Scarab to start with. This is a 2-cost 1/2. It is a sea monster, and it has the deep keyword. It also says when another ally dies or last breath, meaning like for itself, toss 1. Now, I know the stats are underwhelming. It's a 2-cost 1/2, but it does have deep. It does have a relevant sea monster tag, though that actually does potentially end up being a nerf to a couple of cards. I'm thinking of like Slaughter Docks, for example. But it's still a relevant keyword. It still has a relevant tag, right? So like deep matters in the decks you want to play this. But the other real appeal to this card for me is that this is a Shadow Isles card that also further gives you toss capabilities, which maybe, probably not, but maybe is enough juice to give you a deck where Maokai doesn't have to be paired with Bilgewater and you don't have to do the Sea Monster deep route. So like if you're a fan of dedicated mill decks and Maokai is something you wanted to do, I know when Maokai was first released, I went heavy with trying to make Shadow Isles plus Piltover and Zaun work because I wanted to at the time run Investigators as your win condition, so you get them low and then you play your 3/2s and force them to draw cards and they draw out faster. And since that time, we've also gotten Hexcore Foundry, which further helps. And so with some of those additional tools, and then now getting something like Sea Scarab, where it's another Shadow Isles specific toss card, maybe it's enough to make that work. Now, I don't think it's going to be a competitive list, but even if it's good enough to meme with, I'm going to be happy. So I think that this card certainly has a place, and I like that they have given Shadow Isles another toss tool. I mean, even with Maokai alone, like just having this on the board, making your saplings and then sacrificing them for the greater good, if you will, really starts to speed up your clock in terms of tossing things out of your deck and getting Maokai up and running. So I like this card as a supplementary like activator. This, I think, is akin to what Puffcat Peddler is for Teemo decks. Now, I think that this being as small as it is and as brittle as it is means it's not necessarily on the same power level as Puffcat Peddler, but it's that same style of card where like you're going to play it and then it's just going to amplify the other things you want to do in your deck. So the other Shadow Isles card that was revealed is Soul Spinner. This is a 3-cost 3/2. It has the spider tag, and it says when I'm summoned, grant me +1/+1 and fearsome if an ally died this round. And I'm gonna be honest, it's very rare that I just outright dog a card because I can usually think of some use for it. But like this card is just not good. Like this is my least favorite card of the new set I've seen. This is not great. Arachnid Horror is a 3/2 with fearsome for 2 with the spider tag, just not even doing anything. This requires something to die just to get it to 4/3 and fearsome, whereas like Callista, now I know Callista's a champion, right? But Callista's just straight up a 3-cost 4/3. And I know that this has the spider tag and maybe that's also relevant, but I would much rather run even still something like Frenzied Skitterer, which used to be a 3/3, mind you, but even at a 3/2 and the very relevant summon effect and the fact that something doesn't have to die and it has fearsome baked in, like this card just is not very good. You don't really want this in your spider decks. Maybe in the spider archetype for expeditions it starts finding a home in that regard, but this card just does not feel good to me. I'm not a fan. All right, moving on. Bilgewater. We're gonna start with Loaded Dice. This is a 4-cost slow spell, but it reads, for the rest of the round, when you damage the enemy Nexus, you nab 1. So there's a lot of potential flashy plays with this, like meme plays. I don't think this is a competitive card, and the nab archetype took a couple of hits through nerfs, but I immediately, when I saw this card, I thought of 2 things. The first thing I thought of was Riptide Rex, like being able to, like if you can get an attack in and they have an empty board or a mostly empty board, and then you can Loaded Dice into a Riptide Rex. This card is chock full of hilarity, because not only are you nabbing a bunch, but you're also you know, stealing from your opponent's deck. Now, I also wanted to say that perhaps if you wanted to go the mill route instead of sea monsters with Maokai, and you still want to pair with Bilgewater. So what I'm saying is if you want to do a Maokai mill deck and you do not want to run Nautilus and the big beefy sea monsters, this also could be a card paired with all of the other Bilgewater toss tools and the Bilgewater nab tools that further help you like have an opportunity to mill people. But this with Riptide Rex is just one of those like, oh, I refill my hand and I took, you know, a ton of cards from your deck. Like, it's just funny. The other thing that kind of made me giggle was the idea of something like Karma and then a bunch of ping spells. So like if you've got, you know, 2 warning shots in your hand and, you know, a parlay or 2, things like that, there's some pretty cost-effective ways that for very cheap, once a Karma is on the board, you can again just turn around and nab, you know, 4 to 8 cards from your opponent very quickly, and then you can turn around and use those, depending on what they are, to further take advantage of a Karma being on the board. So again, just want to say, not likely a competitive thing, but in terms of just fun, I think there's going to be some satisfying moments there. So the other Bilgewater card is Lost Riches. This is a 4-cost burst spell, and it reads draw a treasure. So that means from your deck, mind you, not create a treasure in hand, draw a treasure. But if there aren't any to draw, you create 2 treasures in your deck instead. Now, I feel like this was probably tested at 3 and proven to be too powerful, because right now, the thing with treasures are, all of the treasures are very solid plays, but the existing ways to get them into your deck are all late game. You know, you're playing like a 7 mana 7/5 just to shuffle them into your deck, and so the payoff for them comes way late in the game, and rightfully so, because they're very powerful cards. Summoning a number of plate worms, for example, should be difficult to do early, but this card maybe gives you the opportunity to start doing that sooner, because if you can play this, you know, on turn 3, that's the soonest you're getting there, likely with the spell mana and so forth available to you. That gives you that many more turns to potentially draw into said treasures. So if you're really trying to go treasure focused, I think that this is a for sure must. And I think that, again, in terms of fun, in terms of highlight reels, being able to play this on 3, and then because, you know, you've probably banked a ton of spell mana at that point and you're just, let's be honest, like not doing much. Maybe on turn 4 or turn 5, if you get lucky, you can play a board full of plate worms and go have fun, right? Run amok. Like, that could be fun. It is also worth noting, though, that if you're doing it that early, you probably don't have deep triggered for your plate worms and for the other things. So you get the good with the bad, right? I don't think this card is good. I don't think it's competitively viable. I would maybe have considered it at 3. So like if I could pass turn 1 and I could pass turn 2, and then I could shuffle 2 treasures in and then just rebound on turn 3 with, you know, going back to playing cards and reestablishing my board, I would feel better about it. But the biggest issue with treasures is they just come so late. This doesn't do much to speed it up. And then even when you do speed it up, I don't know. Like, Keelbreaker's nice early. Obviously, the one where you make a bunch of cards and they're all free could be game breaking if you get it super early. And, you know, the plate worms aren't bad. You still get a bunch of 5/5s. But it's a pretty big trade-off for just hopes and dreams that early on. So that's it. You know, fun, not viable. I'm not going to talk about it anymore. We're going to move on. We got a whole bunch of regions to cover still. So we're going to go to the next graphic. We're going to start in the top left again, and this is the Piltover and Zaun cards. First, we have Production Surge. This is technically a 0-cost slow spell. However, it says to play, spend all your mana. So think just like the Thermal Beam. And when you spend all your mana, you summon random turrets whose total cost equals the mana spent. Now, we don't know the algorithm for how it's creating the turrets, so that's going to make a really big impact on how good this card is. For example, if you spend 3 mana and it makes, you know, 1 3-drop turret, but it also fills your board the rest of the way with 0-drop turrets, because that technically adds up to 3, this card is insane. But I don't think that's the case. So the next logical step is that it only gives you numbered ones, or it might give you a chance at 0, in which case the card would have to be written where it basically says, create a turret from, you know, your cost 0 through X, whatever it is, the amount of mana you spent. And then once you've done that, you lower the cost of X based on the cost of the turret, and then you repeat. And so I word it that way because in theory, if that's the case, you could sometimes get 0-cost turrets, but the chances of flooding your board every time with 0-cost turrets is significantly lower. But I personally suspect it will only be the numbered ones, and in that instance, I think that this card is okay. I mean, it's certainly a Heimerdinger card. You want turrets when you're playing Heimer, and it's kind of nice because if you're trying to level Heimer up quickly, you're kind of doubling the rate at which you do it with this card. And what I mean by that is, let's say you play Heimer on 5 and you have 3 spell mana banked. Normally you'd play a 3-mana spell, you would drop a 3/1 turret, and that gives you credit of 3 towards leveling Heimer based on the power of his turrets. Now, if you have Heimer on 5 and you play this card for 3, you're going to summon turrets and then still also create the turret in hand from the Heimer effect, who then plays that turret, so you'll get credit for 6 total power in turrets with that play. So like in a Heimer deck, if your goal is to level up Heimer and get a bunch of turrets up and running, even if it's just chump blockers, you know, it might be good there. It could find a home. But this is very clearly a Heimer specific card. I struggle to think of a deck that wants to play this that is not also running Heimerdinger. It might exist. I just struggle to think of it. Maybe I'm not creative enough. I don't know. But that's Production Surge. Next up, we have my favorite card from the reveals today, I think. Concurrent Timelines is a 1-cost slow spell. And it reads, for the rest of the game, the first time you play a follower each round, you pick one of 3 followers with the same cost to transform it into. Now, there's a lot of things that you need to take into account here. First, this is a for the rest of the game effect, which means that you probably only want to play this once. And being that it's a 1-cost card, though, you probably still want to run 3 copies of it. So there's that age-old question of what do you do with the extra copies if they don't further transform. Now, there is a small % chance, I do not think it works this way. Oh, good Lord, it would be insane. But there's a small % chance that if you play multiples, maybe it transforms and then it transforms a second time. But I'll talk about why I don't think that's the case in a minute. It's more likely just a one-time thing. And the good news is you're in Piltover and Zaun, so you probably have ways to discard cards. Rummage comes to mind. So if you do end up with your other copies later, you can discard them. So it's less of a big deal in this region if you get hung up with multiples of these and you draw them later. All right, now to talk about why I don't think that it will give you multiple transforms, and that's by highlighting the way that it works with even a single transform. So when you play the follower, it's still going to come into play and then transform. So that means you will get credit for any summon effect. So that means if you play a Rekindler after you've played Concurrent Timelines, for example, it's still going to summon a dead champion, and then Rekindler will become one of 3 7-cost followers from your choice by transforming into it. Now, it's also worth noting that whatever it transforms into, if it has a summon effect, now it's not play effect, mind you, but if it has a summon effect, it too then would trigger that as well. Now that's relevant because you do get play effects from the first one you play because you're playing that card. So you could also, for example, and this is the one that's like been blowing up on social media, you could play Concurrent Timelines, and then if you play Ledros, you get the trigger put on the stack because you've played Ledros, and then Ledros has the potential to transform into another 9-cost follower, and if Dreadway is presented as an option, you could just win the game if they don't have an answer for the trigger or an answer for the Dreadway at that moment, because it's still going to do the Ledros thing, but Dreadway's going to double it, and that's like a known one-turn kill combo in the game. But there's a bunch of just other really good potential outcomes. Like if you play this on turn 1 and you play a 2-drop, you could, let's just say you're playing like PNZ and Targon. You could play this on turn 1. On turn 2, you play the 3/1 that gives you 2 spell mana. That triggers when it's summoned, and then it gets transformed, and maybe because it's a 2-drop, you are presented with Boxtopus. And we all know how annoying that card is when it does not have to have the play effect attached to it, and so you would just get a 3/4 challenger. There's a bunch of stuff that could happen. Now it also could end up horrible for you, but because you get to choose amongst 3, it's likely going to be good. Now the reason this is my favorite card, I've said in the past, one of my favorite champions to build around and to play with for a long time has been Callista, because I love taking cards that have summon effects and then trying to abuse them. And Callista's a great way to do it because every time she attacks, the thing she's bringing back summons and does something, right? So in the past, I've had like Callista Bilgewater decks with Zap and Rekindler, stuff that makes kegs, you name it. Concurrent Timelines is the kind of card that says like you can build a deck around followers that have summon effects so that you still get the summon effect, and then maybe you get an upgrade or another cool effect from the transformation. So from a deck building standpoint, I'm actually really excited to tinker with this. And as I said before, I don't think that if you play multiples of these, you get multiple transformations, because otherwise you get a play effect into a summon effect into a summon effect, like into insanity. Like there's a lot of things that I think could potentially go haywire there, but who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. I can't wait to test it. I can't wait to play with this card. It's my favorite of the reveals from today, I think, by a long shot. All right, moving on to Targon. We've got Stripped Peak. This is a 2-cost landmark, has a countdown of 2, and it says you create 2 random celestial cards that cost 3 or less in hand. This is okay for Invoke. I mean, I think it's going to be good in an Invoke-based Expedition deck where you don't get to just main deck 3 Zoes. But I think the biggest issue here is like when you run Zoe, for example, 1, you get the unit, so you can start pressuring things and that you kind of force them to deal with the Zoe. But 2, you get presented, when you play her spell, you get presented with 3 options and you can pick the one that's most beneficial. This is straight random. You get 2, but it's straight random. But it is a 2-for-1. The real benefit, I think, from this is also if you are just planning on using any of the Behold options for your late game bombs. So a place where this might fit would be if you're playing something like a Aurelion, Soul, Aphelios late game Invoke based Targon list, and you're not running Zoe in that instance. A card like this could be good because just even getting 2 random celestial cards means that you're gonna be able to likely play one and save the other one as a Behold option should you need it. So I can see some situations where including this card could be beneficial, but I do not think this is like a auto include in every Invoke Targon list kind of card. It's not like S tier celestial inclusion. Next up for Targon, we have Destiny's Call. This is maybe my second favorite card, probably my third. I really like Field Musicians too. This is probably my third favorite card from the reveals, not because it's good. I do not believe this card will be competitively viable by any stretch of the imagination, but This is a very fun meme card. So this is an 8 cost burst spell that says grant an ally in hand +8/+8. And that's it. You just give an ally in hand +8/+8. And the reason I like it is because, again, we were just talking about Zoe. Drawing a late game Zoe and then spending 8 to make her become a 9/9 elusive just sounds funny to me. You know, doing that with Teemo sounds funny to me. Doing this because this is in Targon and Porofly is in Targon, for example. Doing this to buff up a Porofly once or twice and then using that spell shielded Poro to get off an atrocity play. Like you spend 1 for a 17/17 Poro that's protected by spell shield and then you toss it at somebody's nexus with atrocity just sounds funny to me. I do not think it's competitively viable, but it sounds fun. Like it's just cute. And obviously there's fun stuff that you can do with karma, and because you're granting an ally in hand, things like counterfeit copies could be kind of neat. Like it's just a meme-tastic card, but it will not make a competitive splash unless there is just something else that we have not seen that you really want to buff in hand. So now we're going to move on to Ionia, and we're going to talk about the other card I had mentioned, which is Field Musicians. This is a 4 cost 1/4 follower with a tune, but it says each round, once you've summoned 3 other allies, you refill your spell mana and draw 1. So to me, I think that this might find a home in some ephemeral lists. So thinking like Shadow Isles and Ionia, because doing something like Haunted Relic to technically gain a mana, because you spend 2 but you refill your spell mana to go back to 3, and then you also draw a card, that is kind of interesting. And when you start getting things like the Shark Chariot going, for example, because when it comes into play that counts as a summon, I think that there are ways that you can get Field Musicians up and running without having to play from hand the 3 or more allies each round. And once somebody finds a good way to abuse that, I think Field Musicians will be a ton of fun. I think it's not quite competitively viable unless, again, there's stuff that I haven't seen yet, but I do think it's actually kind of on the cusp. I think this card is better than it looks on paper, because anytime that you give yourself a recurring mana and draw engine, it's probably going to perform better than you think. This actually kind of reminds me of Temple. When we saw Temple revealed with Aphelios, I was thinking it was like good, not great. And then having played with it, I drastically changed my opinion. The card is awesome. And Field Musicians is not Temple because it's only spell mana, and I think it's got a much steeper requirement. But when somebody finds a way to make this work, it will end up being, I think, good in whatever list wants it. So this is one of those cards that I say like earmark for later. Now the other Ionia card is also looking to potentially support the ephemeral archetype. This is Shadow Apprentice. It is a 1 cost 1/1, but it has the elusive keyword. And it says when I'm summoned, you grant me +1/+1 if an ally has ephemeral. So if you see an ephemeral ally, you get yourself a very cost-effective 2/2 elusive for 1 mana. Seems straightforward. I think this is obviously ephemeral dependent, which I think hurts its viability right now, but could be a great inclusion in those lists. Now the last region to cover is Noxus, and for whatever reason, Noxus got 3 reveals. All the other regions only had 2. And so we're going to start with Crimson Bloodletter, and this is a card that I actually kind of like. Crimson Bloodletter is a 1 cost 1/2 follower that says the next time you summon another ally, deal 1 to it and grant me +1/+1. Now it is the next time, it's not every time, which is kind of a bummer, but for Vlad decks, for Scargrounds decks, I think this is a great 1-drop. Those decks in the past kind of, like, unless you paired it with Freljord and you were, running the 0/3 that gets bigger when it takes damage, you weren't really running very effective 1-drops. I think that this one is a great one to include in those lists because it helps to activate things, and you potentially end up with a 2/3 for the cost of 1 mana. I also think that this, you know, I'm kind of glad that some of those Crimson units got nerfed, because you know, there was a time when the 2/3 did 2 damage, and being able to start with a Bloodletter into that and deal 2 to your opponent, and then stick around and also hit that with a Demolitionist, for example, there could have been a lot of burn there, and it's possible that still might be good enough. I don't know, but my instinct says this is a great, like, Scargrounds Vlad style card. That deck hasn't historically been good enough to be competitive, but it certainly welcomes this in the archetype. And then, as I was saying, maybe this finds its way into certain burn decks or certain other decks that can take advantage of the ping in some beneficial ways. But I like the card. I like that it exists. Quality common. All right, next up we have Strength in Numbers. This is an 8-cost slow spell, and it just very simply reads, you summon 2 Legion Marauders. Now, Legion Marauder is an existing card in the game, and to refresh your memory if you do not remember, Legion Marauder is the 3-cost 3/2 that says on attack you grant allied Legion Marauders everywhere +1/+1. So decks that want to run Marauder obviously get this as an additional tool to help further buff them, because before, the thing that kind of hurt is, you know, you're paying 3 for a 3/2, so that's something that dies to Mystic Shot. There's a chance you never get to attack with it. If you do get to attack with it, okay, it becomes a cost-effective 4/3, and it's buffing your other ones, so you can kind of snowball. But it was just, you know, Noxus is usually a region that wants to either go fast or play for the late game with Swain somehow, and Legion Marauder is that, like, slow scaling style of play that just doesn't necessarily fit in Noxus. But giving it a tool like this, maybe it's enough to push it over. If you play Strength in Numbers successfully as early as turn 5 after banking spell mana, and you do get to attack with both of them, then you have spent 8 mana on turn 5 to attack with 2 5/4s, and that's assuming you haven't played other Legion Marauders somewhere along the way. So, you know, turn 5 getting a pair of 5/4s that are going to continue to scale every time they attack, maybe that is worth it. I don't know. Probably not. My instinct says no, because they don't have any keywords still. I think Legion Marauder really needs something to help it, but again, just support for other archetypes, support for older archetypes, I'm always a big fan of, so that they don't just, like, create something and then abandon it, leave it hanging out to dry sort of thing. Like, I like that they printed this card. So the last card that was revealed is a spider, but in Noxus. So this is a 4-cost 2/5 with the spider tag. Its name is Shrieking Spinner, and it says on attack, grant spider allies +1/+0. I actually really like this card for spider decks. I think that this is good enough to make the cut and become almost a requirement in spider dedicated decks. Now, it's been a long time since Elise has, like, truly been viable, so whether or not this is enough to push her back into the spotlight, we'll have to wait and see. But the fact that this is grant, it's permanent, is very important. It's a big deal. The fact that it has 5 health, so it's got that sturdy back end and it can potentially survive more than one attack to give you even bigger bonuses, is a very big deal. And it says spider allies, not other spider allies, so it buffs itself as well. So really, you know, cost wise, as long as you're playing this and then getting that attack out of it, you know, you're getting likely a 3/5 with upside that's buffing your entire squad. I mean, we've already seen how effective in other go wide decks something like the Arena Battlecaster can be, and that's only giving +1/+0. Now granted, Arena Battlecaster is also far more cost effective. It's 2 instead of 4, but playing an Arena Battlecaster in your spider themed deck that's going to continue to buff your spiders, again, I think is potentially very relevant. So I like this card. I think that it's a great addition to the spider archetype, and in those decks it will absolutely find a home. And I think it could be really scary in expeditions if you take the spider archetype. But that's it for the reveals. There was a lot to cover in today's reveal because there was a lot of cards, so today's video is much longer than usual. And if you made it this far, if you listened to all of my ranting, then you are a saint. Thank you. I appreciate you. Make sure you're putting stuff in the comments. I want to hear what other people think about the cards, what kind of decks you want to brew. Let me know what your favorites were from this batch, since I told you what mine were. And you know, that's it for this video. I will see you in the next one.